They left her for dead in the middle of the street. The dust of Bitter Creek was already settling on her like a burial shroud. It coated her torn calico dress, stained with blood that had dried to the color of rust. Her body was crumpled like a discarded doll, one leg twisted beneath her at an angle that defied nature. The bone jutting out, a sharp white punctuation mark against the fabric. The other leg was a roadmap of cruelty, a tapestry of purple and black bruises that told a story nobody in this town wanted to read. Her name was Eunice Marie Thompson. She was 19, but the last few months had aged her a lifetime. People walked by. They saw her. They just didn't see her. Mrs. Henderson, the owner of the general store, peered through her window, her face pinching with something that might have been sympathy, before she turned away to count inventory that didn't need counting. The preacher's son stared from the church steps, his face pale, until his mother snatched him back inside, hissing about minding his own business. And Sheriff Walsh, the law in this godforsaken town, he just lit his pipe on the boardwalk. He watched the smoke curl into the merciless morning sun and did absolutely nothing. His silence was the loudest sound on the street. It was the sound of a town that had sold its soul. Eunice's breathing was a shallow, ragged thing. Just drawing air felt like lifting a boulder. She tasted blood and dust. She thought about her husband, Thomas. He'd been a quiet man, kind. His hands, though calloused from work, had always been gentle with her. He'd brought her to Bitter Creek with a wagon full of hand-me-down furniture and promises that felt as solid as the mountains. But consumption had taken him before the first frost, his lungs filling with a dark tide until he just faded away. She'd buried him herself, clawing at the hard, ungiving earth. And she'd stayed. That was her mistake. She had nowhere else to go, so his family, Clifton Ray and his wife Viola Kay, had taken her in. It wasn't charity. It was an investment in a new punching bag. They were hard people, worn down by failed harvests and curdled dreams. Her presence was a constant reminder of their losses, and they made her pay for it every single day. First, it was neglect. Scraps for dinner, a cold back room where the wind howled through the walls. Then, the neglect sharpened into cruelty. Viola Kay's words were like acid, accusing her of laziness, of shaming Thomas's memory. Clifton Ray was worse. When he drank, his words turned to poison, his breath hot and sour as he'd corner her and whisper all the ways she was worthless. He never hit her, not at first, but he didn't have to. He was breaking her from the inside out. Last night, it all boiled over. He'd come home drunk and furious, screaming that she was a burden, a thief, a leech bleeding them dry. For the first time, Eunice tried to speak up, and that's when his hand flew out. The slap sent stars bursting behind her eyes. She stumbled back, trying to escape, but her foot caught on a loose porch board. The sound it made, a dry, sickening crack like a gunshot, echoed in the sudden silence. The snap of her own bone. But they didn't stop. Oh no, they weren't done with her yet. They dragged her screaming to their wagon. They threw her in the back like a sack of garbage and dumped her in the middle of the main street. "Let the vultures have her!" Viola Kay had spat, her face a mask of pure hatred. Then they were gone, leaving her broken in the dirt. That was 8 hours ago. The sun was a hammer, beating down on her. Flies buzzed at the edges of her wounds. She thought about just letting go. It would be so easy to just stop breathing. No one would even notice. She'd be just another ghost in a town full of them. But then a shadow fell over her. A pair of worn leather boots stepped into her line of sight. Scuffed, dusty boots that had seen 1,000 miles of hard road. A man knelt beside her. His movements were slow, deliberate, like he was approaching a cornered animal. "You breathing, girl?" His voice was rough, like gravel scraped over rock, but there was something in it. Not pity, not disgust, something else, a kind of weary understanding. She managed the smallest of nods. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, took in the broken leg, the bruises, the absolute defeat clinging to her. And in that gaze, for the first time in months, she felt like a person again. "Gonna lift you now," he said, his voice low and steady. "It's gonna hurt something fierce, but I'll be gentle as I can." He didn't wait for her to answer. He slipped his arms under her, one beneath her shoulders, the other under her knees. A scream tore from her throat as white-hot fire erupted in her leg, but his grip was like iron. He held her secure, as if she weighed nothing at all. "I got you," he murmured. And through the agony, through the haze of despair, a tiny part of her actually believed him. He was a tall man, weathered by the sun, with silver streaks in his dark beard. He carried her right through the center of town, past the silent watchers, the ghosts who'd left her to die. Sheriff Walsh stepped forward, opening his mouth. "Wilbur," the sheriff said, his voice quiet, almost a warning. "You sure about this?" The man Wilbur didn't answer. He just kept walking, his jaw set like stone. He carried her past the gawking faces, up a winding trail that led to a ridge overlooking the town. There was a small cabin there, nestled in the pines. Smoke curled from the chimney. It looked safe. Inside, he laid her gently on a narrow bed. The sheets were rough but clean. The pain in her leg was a roaring inferno. But as she looked up at the hand-hewn ceiling beams, she felt a flicker of something she thought was long dead. Hope. "Name's Wilbur Green," he said, breaking the silence. "Not much for talk, but I know how to set a bone." He looked at her, waiting. "You got a name?" The word was trapped in her throat, buried under so much pain and shame. How could she tell him her name was Eunice when it had been used as a curse for so long? He didn't push. He just moved around the cabin with a quiet, efficient grace. He knelt by her leg, his touch surprisingly gentle. "This is gonna hurt like hell," he warned, uncorking a bottle of whiskey. He poured some over the raw, exposed break. The alcohol was liquid fire. She cried out, arching her back. He offered her the bottle. She took a long, desperate swallow, the cheap whiskey burning a path down her throat. Then he took her ankle in one hand, her thigh in the other. And he pulled. The sound that ripped from her wasn't human. It was the sound of pure, primal agony. The grinding of bone on bone was the sound of the world ending. She felt a clean, perfect alignment, a click as the broken ends met. And then, mercifully, the world went black. When she woke, it was dark. A single candle flickered on a small table, casting long, dancing shadows on the cabin walls. She saw Wilbur slumped in a chair across the room, fast asleep, his boots still on. He'd stayed with her, this stranger, this man who had shown her more kindness in a few hours than her own family had in months. The pain was still there, a sharp, insistent throb. But it was different now. It was a healing pain. She could wiggle her toes. For the first time since that porch board snapped, she believed she might actually walk again. The next few days were a blur of pain and healing. Wilbur tended to her with a quiet, steady patience. He changed her bandages, applying poultices that smelled of herbs in the forest. He fed her broth when she was too weak to lift a spoon. He never asked what happened. He didn't have to. The bruises on her skin told the story well enough. He just sat in his chair, whittling small, intricate animals from pieces of scrap wood, his presence a silent, comforting weight in the room. On the third day, she found her voice. "Eunice," she whispered. The name felt foreign on her tongue. He looked up from the wooden bird he was carving. He didn't smile, just gave a single, solemn nod. "Eunice, that's a strong name." He held up the small bird. It was a songbird, its wings outstretched as if about to take flight. She looked at the bird, then back at him. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Why did you help me?" Wilbur set the bird down on the bedside table. He stared into the fire for a long moment before he answered. "Because," he said, his voice low and rough, "I made a promise to a friend a long time ago." He paused and a shadow passed over his face. A promise to look after his own. Her blood ran cold. "A friend?" she asked, her heart starting to pound in her chest. Wilbur finally turned to look at her, and his winter sky eyes were filled with a sorrow so deep it stole her breath. "His name was Thomas," he said. The world tilted on its axis. Thomas? Her Thomas? How could this man know her husband? Thomas had never mentioned a Wilbur Green. He'd never spoken of a friend living up on this ridge. 1,000 questions swirled in her mind, but one screamed louder than the rest. A promise to look after his own? What did that mean? You knew my husband, she managed to say. Knew him. Wilbur let out a short, bitter laugh that held no humor. Girl, I was his brother. Brother? Thomas didn't have a brother. He was an only child. His parents had died years ago. Clifton Ray was his cousin, not his brother. A lie. It had to be a lie. But why? Why would this man lie about something so fundamental? She stared at him, trying to see past the weathered face and the haunted eyes, searching for some trace of the man she had married. There was nothing. This man was a stranger. You're lying, she said, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and confusion. Thomas didn't have a brother. Wilbur sighed, a long, weary sound that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. He reached into the pocket of his worn coat and pulled out a small, tarnished silver locket. He opened it and held it out to her. Inside were two tiny faded portraits. On one side was a young woman with a kind smile she didn't recognize. On the other was a young man with familiar eyes. Thomas's eyes, but it wasn't Thomas. My name is Wilbur Thompson, he said quietly. Thomas was my younger brother. We were separated as boys after our parents passed. He was sent to live with our aunt and uncle. I went another way. The pieces didn't fit. They were jagged and sharp, and they hurt her head to try and put together. If he was Thomas's brother, why had he never come to the wedding? Why had Thomas never spoken of him? I don't understand, she whispered. Why hide? Why now? Because of them, Wilbur said, his voice hardening. Clifton and Viola Kay. They hated our side of the family. They poisoned my aunt and uncle against me, filled Thomas's head with lies. Said I was dangerous, a drifter, no good. By the time I came back to this part of the country, Thomas was already sick. I tried to see him. Clifton ran me off with a shotgun, said I wasn't welcome. He looked at her, his eyes pleading for her to believe him. I've been watching, from up here. I saw how they treated you after he passed. I saw the bruises starting to appear. I was just trying to figure out a way to get you out of there without getting us both killed. And then they left you in the street. The story was wild, unbelievable, and yet it explained so much. The strange animosity from Clifton and Viola Kay, which always seemed deeper than simple resentment. The feeling she always had that there was a part of Thomas's past he kept hidden away. She looked at the locket again, at the face of the young man who looked so much like her husband. She looked at Wilbur's face, etched with grief and regret. And she knew he was telling the truth. This man wasn't just a kind stranger, he was family, the only family she had left. A wave of relief washed over her, so potent it almost made her dizzy. But it was followed by a cold, sharp spike of fear. If Clifton ran Wilbur off with a shotgun once, what would he do now that he knew Wilbur had taken her in? This wasn't over. It was just beginning. Over the next few weeks, as her legs slowly mended, the cabin on the ridge became a sanctuary. Wilbur taught her things: how to track animals, how to identify medicinal herbs, how to load and fire the old shotgun that hung over the mantel. A woman's got to know how to protect herself in this world, he'd say, his voice grim. She learned more about him, too. He'd lived a hard life, working on cattle drives, in mines even, she suspected, on the wrong side of the law for a time. But his love for his brother had been the one true compass of his life, and his failure to protect Thomas from the slow, creeping poison of consumption and the faster poison of Clifton Ray was a guilt he carried every single day. He'd never married, never had children. The woman in the locket, he explained, was a sweetheart he'd lost to fever years ago. Her name was Sarah. He had carved her name into the wooden mantle, a small private tribute. Two lonely souls brought together by a shared grief. They fell into a quiet rhythm. She would cook, clean, tend the small garden out back. He would hunt, chop wood, and stand guard. There was a comfortable silence between them, the kind that exists between people who have seen the worst of the world and found a safe harbor in each other. But the peace was a fragile thing, a thin sheet of ice over a dark, churning river. They both knew Clifton Ray wouldn't just let this go. He was a man whose pride was as brittle as old bone. Wilbur taking her was an insult he wouldn't tolerate, and they had something he wanted. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Wilbur grew quiet. "There's something else you need to know on Eunice," he said, not looking at her. "Something about Thomas's death." She tensed. "What about it?" "It was consumption. I was there. I saw it." "Did you?" Wilbur asked, his voice soft. "Did you see it? Or did you see what Viola Kay wanted you to see?" He explained that Viola Kay had been the one administering most of Thomas's medicine in his final weeks. "A special tea she brewed," she'd said. "An old family recipe to ease the lungs." Eunice had been so consumed with grief and exhaustion, she'd just been grateful for the help. "Thomas was getting better for a while," Wilbur said, his eyes fixed on the flames. "He was weak, yeah, but the fever had broken. He wrote me a letter, said he was feeling stronger. Said he had something important to tell me. Something about Clifton and the deed to the land." The deed. Thomas's father had left him the entire 100-acre parcel, the most fertile land in the valley. Clifton had only inherited the small rocky plot his own house sat on. It had been a source of bitter resentment for years. "The letter was the last I ever heard from him," Wilbur continued. "2 days later, Sheriff Walsh rode out to my camp and told me my brother was dead. Said the consumption came back with a vengeance. Took him in the night." He finally turned to look at her, and his face was a mask of cold fury. "Consumption doesn't come back like a flash flood, Eunice. It's a slow burn. But some poisons work fast." The implication hung in the air between them, thick and suffocating. Viola Kay's tea, the sudden downturn, the deed. It wasn't consumption. It was murder. They hadn't just abused her. They had killed her husband. They had made her an unwitting accomplice, spoon-feeding him the very poison that was stopping his heart. The grief and rage that filled her was so immense, so powerful it almost choked her. All this time she had mourned the man they had murdered, while living under their roof, eating their food, enduring their cruelty. "The deed," she whispered, her mind racing. "Where is it?" "He must have hidden it," Wilbur said. "That's what they were after. That's why they were torturing you. They thought he'd told you where it was." She thought back, sifting through the foggy memories of those last awful days. Thomas had been weak, often delirious, but there were moments of clarity. He'd been clutching his Bible, the old worn leather one his mother had given him. He kept trying to tell her something, his voice a hoarse whisper she couldn't understand. He tapped a page, his finger weak and trembling, his eyes desperate. At the time, she'd thought it was just the fever dreams. But now, the Bible. Of course, it was the one thing he owned that Clifton and Viola Kay wouldn't have thought to look through. They saw it as nothing more than a book of empty words. "The Bible," she said, her voice firm. "It's in the Bible." She knew exactly where it was. After the funeral, she had packed Thomas's few belongings into a small wooden chest. His razor, a few worn shirts, and his Bible. When Clifton and Viola Kay had thrown her out, they'd tossed the chest into the back of the wagon. They hadn't even bothered to open it. They dumped it with her in the street. In their haste and their cruelty, they had delivered the one thing they were desperate to find right into Wilbur's hands. Wilbur had brought the chest up to the cabin along with her. It sat in the corner, a silent monument to a life cut short. With trembling hands they opened it. The smell of cedar and old paper filled the small room. There it was, resting on top of a folded shirt. The King James Bible, its leather cover cracked with age. Eunice took it, her fingers tracing the faded gold lettering of his name. She opened it to the Book of Psalms, his favorite. And there, tucked between the pages of the 23rd Psalm, was a folded piece of paper. It wasn't the deed, it was a letter, written in Thomas's familiar, shaky hand. "My dearest Eunice," it began. "If you are reading this, then the worst has happened, and Viola's medicine has done its work. Do not grieve for me. Live for me. Wilbur will find you. He is my brother and my only true friend. Trust him. He knows what to do. The proof of Clifton's crimes is not in this book, but the key to it is, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures." Green pastures. It was a clue. But what did it mean? They read the line over and over. Green pastures, Wilbur repeated, pacing the small cabin. It's a place. It has to be a place. They thought of every meadow, every field on the property. Nothing seemed right. It felt too obvious. Clifton would have searched those places 100 times. Eunice closed her eyes, trying to picture Thomas in his final days. He was a simple man, a man of habit. He had his routines, his morning walk, his evening pipe on the porch, his weekly trip to town, to the bank, the Bitter Creek Bank and Trust, a solid, imposing brick building on the main street. Its founder, a stuffy old man from back east, had been named Alistair Green. "Green," she said, her eyes flying open. "Wilbur, the founder of the bank was named Green." Wilbur stopped pacing. A slow smile spread across his face. Of course, the safety deposit boxes. He wouldn't have hidden it on the farm. He'd have hidden it in plain sight. Thomas must have rented a box. The clue wasn't pointing to a place on the farm, but to the bank itself. The key had to be here, somewhere in the Bible. They examined the book again, this time with a new purpose. They ran their fingers over every page, checked the spine, the cover. Nothing. It seemed like a dead end. Eunice was about to give up when her finger brushed against something odd on the inside of the back cover. A small, almost invisible slit in the leather. Using the tip of her knife, Wilbur carefully pried it open, and there, nestled in a hidden compartment, was a small brass key, the key to everything. Now they had a choice. They could take the key, ride out of the valley, and never look back. Start a new life somewhere else, or they could stay. They could fight. They could get the proof and expose Clifton Ray for the murderer and thief he was. Looking at Wilbur's determined face, at the quiet strength in his eyes, Eunice knew there was no choice at all. They weren't running. They were going to get justice for Thomas. The plan was simple and incredibly dangerous. They had to get into that bank. But the bank was the center of town, and Clifton Ray's eyes were everywhere. They'd need a diversion, a big one. Wilbur knew a man, an old prospector named Jedediah, who lived deep in the hills. Jedediah hated Clifton Ray even more than Wilbur did, after Clifton had cheated him out of a claim years ago. He was known for being eccentric and for his love of dynamite. Wilbur rode out under the cover of darkness. He returned just before dawn with a grim smile and a heavy saddlebag. The plan was set for the next night. As dusk fell, a series of explosions echoed from the north side of the valley, near Clifton's main grazing lands. Jedediah was putting on a show. Panic erupted in Bitter Creek. Men grabbed rifles, thinking it was a cattle rustler raid. Sheriff Walsh organized a posse, and the entire town, including Clifton and his hired thugs, rode north towards the sound and the smoke. It was the diversion they needed. The town was empty. They moved like ghosts through the darkened streets. Eunice, her leg now strong enough to run on, felt a strange thrill. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a burning sense of purpose. This wasn't just for Thomas anymore. This was for her, for the woman they had tried to break, the woman they had left for dead. They reached the back of the bank. Wilbur, it turned out, had more skills than just setting bones and tracking deer. He made short work of the lock on the back door. Inside, the air was stale and silent. The moonlight streaming through the tall windows cast long shadows on the marble floor. They found the vault. It was a massive steel door with a complex combination lock. For a heart-stopping moment, Eunice thought they had failed. But Wilbur just grinned. He pulled a strange metal device from his bag, a stethoscope. He pressed it to the steel door, closed his eyes, and began to turn the dial. He wasn't a safe-cracker by trade, he explained in a whisper, but he'd picked up a few things in his travels. The soft clicks of the tumblers falling into place were the loudest sounds Eunice had ever heard. With a heavy groan, the vault door swung open. The safety deposit boxes were lined up in neat, gleaming rows. They found the one that matched the number on their key. Eunice's hand was shaking so badly she could barely fit the key into the lock. She turned it. Click. She pulled open the small metal door. Inside was a stack of papers, tied with a ribbon. The deed to the farm was on top, but underneath it was something far more valuable. A ledger book. Eunice opened it. Page after page was filled with Thomas's neat, careful handwriting. It was a detailed record of every crime Clifton Ray had committed for the last 5 years. Rustled cattle, falsified brands, fraudulent land sales. He'd been systematically cheating and stealing from every rancher in the valley. Thomas had been building a case, and he had signed his own death warrant. They had it. They had the proof. They slipped out of the bank and back into the shadows, their hearts pounding with triumph. They were halfway back to the ridge when they heard the sound of hoofbeats. Fast. Too fast. The diversion hadn't held. Someone had figured it out. They flattened themselves behind a rock outcropping as a single rider thundered past. It was Sheriff Walsh, but he wasn't riding towards the cabin. He was riding away from it, towards the main road out of the valley. Strange. Why wasn't he with the posse? Why was he riding out of town? They made it back to the cabin, breathless and exhausted. They barred the door, and Wilbur took up a position by the window with his rifle. They knew Clifton would be coming. The bank would have been the first place he checked after finding the cabin empty. The waiting was the worst part. Every rustle of leaves, every hoot of an owl, sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through Eunice's veins. The attack came just before dawn. It wasn't just Clifton and his 2 hired guns this time. It was a small army. At least a dozen men, their faces illuminated by torchlight, surrounded the cabin. "Wilbur Thompson!" Clifton's voice boomed through the pre-dawn stillness. "I know you're in there, and I know what you took. Give me the ledger and the girl, and I might let you walk out of here alive." "Not likely, Clifton," Wilbur yelled back, his voice steady. "Your walking days are over." A gunshot shattered the window next to Wilbur's head, showering him with glass. The siege had begun. The next hour was a blur of smoke, splintering wood, and the deafening roar of gunfire. Wilbur was a force of nature. He moved from window to window, firing with a calm, deadly precision. Eunice, her fear replaced by a cold, hard resolve, loaded the shotgun over and over, her hands working with a speed she didn't know she possessed. She saw one of Clifton's men trying to sneak around to the back of the cabin, a torch in his hand. He was going to burn them out. Without thinking, she raised the shotgun, aimed, and pulled the trigger. The kick slammed her back against the wall, but the man crumpled to the ground, the torch sputtering out in the damp earth. She had just taken a man's life. There was no time to process it, no time for anything but survival. But they were outnumbered. It was only a matter of time. The front door was beginning to splinter under the assault. They were coming through. Wilbur shoved the ledger into her hands. "There's a loose floorboard under the bed," he said, his voice grim. "Hide this. No matter what happens, don't let them get it. Now get in the root cellar." "I'm not leaving you," she screamed over the gunfire. "That wasn't a request," he roared, his eyes blazing. He shoved her toward the back room just as the front door burst open. The last thing she saw was Wilbur standing his ground, rifle blazing, as the shadows of men poured into the cabin. She scrambled into the tiny dark root cellar, pulling the heavy door closed just as she heard a sickening thud, followed by a cry of pain. Wilbur's cry. Silence. The gunshots had stopped. She could hear men moving around in the cabin above, their heavy boots thudding on the floorboards. They were searching, tearing the place apart. She held her breath, pressing herself into the damp earth, praying they wouldn't find her. "She's not here," she heard Clifton's voice, raw with fury. "And the ledger's gone too. Find them. Find them both." The footsteps faded as they moved outside to search the surrounding woods. Eunice stayed hidden in the dark, her body trembling uncontrollably, tears streaming down her face. She had no idea if Wilbur was alive or dead. She was alone again. She waited for what felt like an eternity. The sun rose and light began to filter through the cracks in the cellar door. She had to know. Slowly, cautiously, she pushed the door open and peered into the cabin. The scene was one of utter devastation. Furniture was overturned, windows shattered, and in the middle of the floor, lying in a pool of his own blood, was Wilbur. He was alive. Barely. He had a nasty bullet wound in his shoulder and a deep gash on his head, but he was breathing. She rushed to his side, tearing strips from her dress to staunch the bleeding. "The ledger," he rasped, his eyes struggling to focus on her. "Did you hide it?" "It's safe," she whispered, tears choking her. "We're not," he said, gritting his teeth in pain. "They'll be back." He was right. Clifton wouldn't give up. He'd scour the entire mountain until he found them. They couldn't stay here. Eunice used every ounce of her strength to get Wilbur to his feet. Leaning on her, he staggered out of the ruined cabin. They had to run. They had to get away. But where could they go? The entire valley was controlled by Clifton Ray. Every road was watched. They were trapped. Then Eunice remembered the old prospector, Jedediah. His camp was deep in the hills in a place so remote and treacherous that even Clifton's men wouldn't dare to go. It was their only hope. The journey was a nightmare. Wilbur was weak from blood loss, and every step was agony for him. Eunice, her own leg aching with the strain, practically carried him. They moved slowly, sticking to the deepest parts of the forest, their ears straining for any sound of pursuit. Twice they had to hide as search parties passed nearby, their coarse laughter and cruel jokes echoing through the trees. After 2 days of walking, they were on the verge of collapse. Wilbur's fever was getting worse. Eunice knew he wouldn't last much longer without proper medical attention. Just as she was about to give up hope, she saw it, a thin wisp of smoke rising from a hidden canyon up ahead. Jedediah's camp. The old prospector was a sight to behold. He had a wild white beard that reached his chest and eyes that glittered with a fierce intelligence. He took one look at Wilbur and ushered them into his small, cluttered shack without a word. He was a surprisingly gentle nurse. He cleaned and stitched Wilbur's wounds with a practiced hand, grumbling under his breath about the evils of Clifton Ray. He fed them a hot, nourishing stew and let them sleep in his own bed while he kept watch outside with a massive buffalo rifle. For the first time in days, Eunice felt a glimmer of safety, but it was short-lived. The next morning, as she was changing Wilbur's bandages, Jedediah came storming into the shack. "They found us," he growled. "Or they're about to. I saw a scout on the ridge. They must have tracked you." Panic seized her. They were cornered. This was the end of the line. Wilbur struggled to sit up. "Give me a rifle," he said, his voice weak but determined. "We're not running anymore." "You're in no shape to fight," Jedediah said, "but I am." He looked at Eunice. "You and the boy here need to get out of sight. There's an old mine shaft behind the camp. It goes deep into the mountain. You can hide in there. I'll slow them down." He was planning to sacrifice himself for them. Eunice wouldn't allow it. "No," she said, her voice ringing with newfound authority. "We're not hiding. We're not running. We're ending this, right here, right now." She had an idea, a desperate, crazy idea, but it was the only one they had. She explained the plan to Jedediah and a feverish but lucid Wilbur. It was a long shot. If it failed, they would all be dead. But if it worked, it would be justice. They didn't have to wait long. Within the hour, Clifton and his remaining men, about 8 of them, rode into the canyon. They were cautious, spreading out, their rifles ready. They saw Jedediah sitting on a rock in front of his shack, calmly cleaning his rifle. "Old man," Clifton called out, his voice full of arrogance. "We're looking for a man and a girl. Seen 'em?" Jedediah spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Might have," he said, not looking up. "What's it to you?" "They have something that belongs to me," Clifton said, his hand straying to the gun on his hip. "And I'm going to get it back. Now you can tell me where they are, or we can do this the hard way." "Always preferred the hard way," Jedediah said with a grin, and he raised his rifle and fired. The shot wasn't aimed at Clifton. It was aimed at a precariously balanced pile of rocks on the cliff face above the entrance to the canyon. The bullet struck home. With a deafening roar, tons of rock and earth came crashing down, completely blocking the only way in or out of the canyon. They were all trapped. Clifton and his men were stunned for a moment. Then their rage turned on Jedediah. They raised their rifles, but before they could fire, a new voice echoed from the rocks above them. "Drop your weapons!" It was Eunice. She was standing on a high ledge, Wilbur's rifle held steady in her hands. On another ledge across the canyon, Wilbur himself appeared, pale and leaning heavily on a rock for support, but with Jedediah's massive buffalo rifle aimed directly at Clifton's chest. They had them pinned down, boxed in a canyon with no escape. Clifton's men looked at each other, their confidence suddenly gone. They were hired guns, not fanatics. This wasn't the easy job they'd signed up for. "It's over, Clifton!" Eunice yelled, her voice carrying a strength she never knew she possessed. "You're not getting the ledger. You're not getting away." Clifton just laughed, a crazed, desperate sound. "You think you've won? You're trapped in here with me, and I've still got more men than you've got bullets." He was right. It was a standoff. But what Clifton didn't know was that the cavalry was coming. Just as he gave the order for his men to open fire, a volley of shots rang out from the canyon entrance, from behind the rock slide. It was Sheriff Walsh, and he wasn't alone. He had a posse of a dozen deputized townsmen with him. The men Clifton had cheated and bullied for years. The preacher, Mrs. Henderson's husband, even the young man who'd stared from the church steps. They had climbed over the rock slide, and they had Clifton's men surrounded. Seeing the sheriff, Clifton's hired guns threw down their weapons immediately. It was over, all except for Clifton. In a final desperate act, he grabbed one of his own men, using him as a human shield, and started backing away, firing wildly up at Eunice and Wilbur. But he was a clumsy shot, blinded by rage. Sheriff Walsh, on the other hand, was not. A single shot rang out. Clifton Ray crumpled to the ground, clutching a bloody leg, his reign of terror finally at an end. Later, as they were loading a snarling Clifton and a weeping Viola Kay, who they'd found back at the ranch, into a prison wagon, Sheriff Walsh came over to Eunice. "I'm sorry I couldn't act sooner," he said, his face full of regret. "I knew what Clifton was. But he owned the judge, the marshals. That ledger was the only thing that could bring him down for good. I had to wait for you to find it." He explained that he'd been the one to send an anonymous letter to Wilbur, telling him of Thomas's illness. He'd been watching over them, waiting for his chance to make things right. His ride out of town hadn't been an escape. He'd been riding to the next county to fetch a federal judge who wasn't in Clifton's pocket. The rebuilding of Bitter Creek began that day. With the ledger as evidence, Clifton Ray's entire criminal enterprise was dismantled. The land he had stolen was returned to its rightful owners. The town, free from the shadow of his tyranny, slowly began to heal. And so did Eunice. She and Wilbur rebuilt the cabin on the ridge, making it bigger, stronger. They replanted the garden. The townspeople, their guilt finally giving way to gratitude, came up to help, bringing lumber and food and apologies. One crisp autumn morning, months later, Eunice stood on the porch of their new home. Her leg was completely healed, leaving only a faint scar. Wilbur came and stood beside her, his arm now fully recovered, wrapping around her shoulders. Down in the valley, the town of Bitter Creek was alive with a newfound sense of community. They weren't ghosts anymore. They were neighbors. "Still standing," Wilbur said quietly, his voice full of a gentle pride. She leaned her head against his shoulder and smiled. "More than standing," she replied. "We're living." The world had tried its best to break her, to bury her in the dust. But instead, it had shown her a strength she never knew she had. It had taught her how to stand up, how to fight back, and how to build a new life from the ashes of the old. If you believe that even in the darkest of places, a single act of courage can change everything, then do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for notifications, because there are a million stories like this one out there. Stories of survival, justice, and the incredible resilience of the human spirit. And I plan on telling every single one of them,